From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Terry Griffin and his co-researcher, LaVona Traywick, will talk about their latest study of precision farming technology adoption, and this time they centered on how the use of technology relates to farmer quality of life. Following then is K-State's Rodrigo Onofre. He's talking about numerous incidents of lodging in corn and grain sorghum stands, pointing to the two stalk rot pathogens largely responsible for that lodging. And in his final radio segment, after 31 years as a weekly guest, K-State's Charlie Lee will take on a long-standing subject of interest in the High Plains, the impact of prairie dog activity on grazing lands. All that next on Agriculture Today. You are tuned in to Agriculture Today. Welcome once more. And opening up today's broadcast, we'll return to a topic that we've touched upon before, but we've added information that we wanted to pass along today. It has to do with precision agricultural technology and adoption trends concerning that technology. Our guests have been studying this closely and from multiple angles over the last couple of years. Joining us once again is K-State Research and Extension precision agricultural economist Terry Griffin, and Terry's colleague is with the Arkansas Colleges of Health Education, where she's an associate professor of physical therapy, LaVona Traywick. We'll quickly recap here some of the previous work that the two of you have accomplished, and then we'll talk about the new angle that you've looked at here. But Terry, if you would do that, and LaVona chime in as well.
So we've been looking at the adoption of agricultural technology for quite some time, and as an economist, I look at things as profitability, dollars and cents, and does the benefits outweigh the cost? And a lot of times economists may take a step further and look at the optimization of utility satisfaction, and which means we need to bring in a few other things besides dollars and cents. And in this case, we're going to look at the quality of life, which makes things better, and along the same lines, the human capital requirement of making things work on the cost side of that equation.
LaVona, what we've known so far about this adoption question, a lot of it has revolved around the age of the operator, has it not?
Yes, it has. And that's what makes it so interesting, is because it's not a straight association between the person's age and whether they adopted or not. There's other factors that go into it, such as, are they a single proprietor on the farm? Are they working with someone from a different generation? So all of these different factors go in. So it's just not a straight age to adoption correlation as one might think. You have to factor in all these other extenuating factors as well. And I think that's where it gets really interesting. It
becomes something of a web, doesn't it?
It does. The age part, there are some general characteristics of the different generations that make them more likely or less likely to adopt the technology. And so that's kind of the starting point that you can look at is, are they going to adopt it? Are they not? But then the other factors play into it. So, for example, if you were born before 1945, you're called the silent generation. Some of us have heard that term before, and they're largely disengaged with technology. Now, this is a generalization. That doesn't mean those who are older don't still want to be in technology, but as a stereotype for that generation, they're largely disengaged, and so they're not going to be your typical adopters. Our baby boomers, however, those born between 1946 and 1964, they were actually early technology adopters. They wanted to master it. They were going to get it and learn it and do it. The only issue is that for many of those, the technology of the time they've learned, they've mastered, but the new technologies that are coming, they're just not looking at those. The Generation X, these are digital immigrants, and they enjoy it. They really like it. The millennials, these born from 1981 to 1996 or 2000, they want to employ it. And then those born after 1997 and younger, they can't live without it. And so, just looking at age in those very stereotypical ways that kind of helps you understand who is more likely to want the technology just to begin with as your baseline before you start putting in all the other factors.
Well, you and Terry have looked at the behavioral patterns here by age, but then you've matched that up with the various technologies, Terry, that have evolved over time and have become available to producers of all ages, and you've found some interesting tie-ins there by technology, right?
I went back to LaVona on this because part of our research together. I shared maybe 15 years ago, she came to me and said, what's something that we can do in agriculture that kind of overlaps the quality of life? And I said, well, at that time, automated guidance was a great example of ag technology that improved quality of life that could be used by people that are becoming older and having neck and shoulder problems. And so we expanded upon that. So, automated guidance as an example, we gave it a very high score for improving the quality of life. And these scores were based upon a couple of decades of applied research. We were doing conversations with farmers and gathering observational data over long periods of time. And on the human capital part, how much is the investment that the person has to make in order to make this work? Well, it's fairly low. So in this case, we gave it a 9 out of 10 for quality of life and 2 out of 10 for required human capital. So it had a very high score on both, which is opposite of something like the yield monitor. So with the yield monitor data, we'd argue that, well, the data on its own really doesn't do anything. It doesn't increase the quality of life. So give it a 1 on quality of life. And it requires a lot of skill in order to make use of it. With automated guidance, it kind of reduced the skill required to make parallel passes through a field. With Yield Monitor, we gave it an 8 on the human capital requirement. So we gave it a 1 on quality of life and 8 on human capital. So it was sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum from automated guidance.
And then you have other types of technologies that fall in between those extremes. One of them, LaVona, is automated section control. Another is imagery, so forth. So, again, those tend to vary in their quality of life factor, if you will.
Yes, they do. One of the things when we're talking about quality of life, it's important to know what we're talking about.
Is that in the eye of the beholder strictly, or can that be categorized?
Today, in 2021, when people talk about quality of life, they're talking about both perceived physical and mental health. And if you notice, I said it's perceived physical and mental health. So that's where I'm going to answer your question. So there's your background on what we're talking about. So that quality of life, those things we're talking about, some of these technologies increase the quality of life. For example, as Terry just mentioned, with automatic guidance, you can do those nice straight rows without the technical skills, right? So that's easier on you. It's less tiring, which could improve your quality of life. The converse about that is that with the other technologies that are out there, we don't have to go to bed with the sun. And so next thing you know, we are working the fields to 2 and 3 in the morning because we've got to get it done. And then it could conversely affect your quality of life because you're not getting enough sleep. You're having family members who are concerned about you because you're not coming home. And so all of these different factors play into whether or not we actually improved quality of life by having the technology, or did we actually decrease our quality of life by having the technology.
We might note here before we finish up that there is an article on the agmanager.info website which covers this, so you might take a look at that, producers. But Terry, how do you and LaVona hope that this information can be of benefit to producers and to others in the agricultural realm?
So we're looking at this not only from the farmer or even the farm equipment operator's perspective, but we're looking at this from the rural household. Okay, so the equipment operator may have a spouse and children, and one of the technologies from the 1970s was a tractor cab. Mm-hmm. And so with tractor cab, people were less fatigued and less grumpy at the end of the day. And we're making some parallels to that and looking at the joint utility function. How satisfied is the rural household, not just the farm equipment operator or the farmer themselves?
Do you think, the both of you, that this can also serve to lend guidance to the industry proper as to what kinds of technology actually is of broad interest to producers? LaVona?
I would definitely say yes. Just as Terry was talking about earlier, it's not just about the quality of life, it's also about the human capital. Mm-hmm. And so some of the technologies that are out there take a lot more human capital in order to utilize them. And things that are easier to use, that take less human capital, are going to be, based upon our research, we project that they're going to be adopted more quickly and more readily than those that require a lot of human capital.
Terry, you and LaVona are not done studying this, are you, by any stretch, right? What's next?
Well, we're continuing to collect data, and some of the most interesting data we're collecting is not necessarily measurements, but it's anecdotal stories. LaVona mentioned the one with the spouse who was concerned that their family members were operating equipment at 3 a.m. instead of being, in bed asleep. And those types of stories that we're trying to collect and build into a larger story.
So you've tons of data to add to this, but so far both of you have come up with quite an assortment of information that can be useful on several levels, as a matter of fact. And there is this article in the agmanager.info portfolio. It's Ag Tech Adoption, and have a look at agmanager.info. LaVona and Terry, thank you for joining us and telling us more about this.
Thank you for having us.
Terry Griffin, precision agricultural economist, K-State Research and Extension, and his colleague, she's an associate professor of physical therapy at the Arkansas Colleges of Health Education, LaVona Traywick. We'll have more for you in a moment on this Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today, and here we are in the very early stages yet of the fall harvest season, but quite a bit of corn has been picked so far in Kansas. We've yet to cut grain sorghum in this state, by and large. In either case, with either crop, we're hearing about stalk lodging problems or potential problems in those fields. So we bring in today row crop disease specialist with K-State Research and Extension, Rodrigo Onofre, to lend some perspective on what's going on out there. And Rodrigo, are you hearing from the countryside that we do have a fair amount of stalk rots at work out there?
Well, Eric, first, thanks for the opportunity to bring me here today. Yeah, so stalk rots, we're already hearing quite a bit of reports, especially in central Kansas. This year, we had a very wet beginning. Some parts of the state, we were not even planted at that time. And we followed by some very drought conditions. Together with the drought, the high temperatures, this stress that the plants went through, it's the perfect storm for the stalk rot or the lodging development, right? And we are already seeing more and more reports of this problem in Kansas.
Those stresses on the plants, they can manifest themselves in many ways, can't they? From nutrient depletions to poor root growth. There is a host of things possible here, right?
That's correct. So basically what these stalk rots will do, they will cut that translocation of nutrients from the base of the stalks to the ear, right? And that might lead to lower yield even before we see the lodging. And that starts after tasseling, after that pollination moment. It's the time when the stalk rot starts to show and develop more out there in the field.
And similar, not the same, but similar activity in grain sorghum. It's a different crop, of course, but the functions are somewhat likened to each other?
Yes, that's correct. Sorghum and corn, they go together with these stalk rot problems, right? And we have two stalk rots. It's good to remember here. We have charcoal rot and fusarium stalk rot. Although they cause similar symptoms, which are similar lodging, right, and lower yields, you can differentiate them while you're there in the field. One way, if you split that stem, you're going to see for charcoal rot some black structures and a shredded stem, a shredded pith when you're open that stem, right? And on the other hand, for fusarium and stalk rot, we're going to see more like a pinkish coloration when you split that stem. So those are two ways to differentiate these two diseases while in the field. Now, if you're out there and you'd like to assess how much problem do you have, right? How do we do that? The best way is just to sample 100 plants scattered in your field, and you can do a pinch test. And when you do that pinch, if it's soft, it means that you probably have a stalk rot problem. Or you can do a push test where you push those plants towards you, and if they snap, you also might have stalk rot problems. And if you would like to see how we identify them or how which one do you have, just split it and check for that either that black structure or that pink coloration. A good thing is always to work with your extension agents out there. They're really good in helping you and sending us the samples as well. So we have here the diagnostic lab at K-State, and we could check the plants and get back to you relatively quickly here.
It's interesting to note as well, when we talk about the stalk rots, the two types, they are somewhat driven by different conditions. One prefers dryness. The other is more a product of wetter conditions, right?
Yeah, that's right. And charcoal rot likes more the high soil temperatures above 90 Fahrenheit and low soil moisture condition, right? Especially that during that grain field stage. On the other hand, Fusarium and stalk rot likes that dry conditions early in the season and warm between 80 to 85 Fahrenheit and wet conditions between after that 2 to 3 weeks after pollination, right? So those would be the two main difference.
The reason that one might want to check their fields before harvest is that if they have stalk rot active, but the plants have not lodged over yet, those fields might be prime candidates for earlier harvest compared to the rest of the acreage one might have, right?
That's right. And the recommendation is if you identify that you have problems with stalk rots, you wanted to harvest with higher than usual moisture content, so you are able to get that grain out of the field and start drying the elevators and at least save it, right? Avoid that lodging.
What could have been done, producers always ask this, to prevent the stalk rots from taking hold? There are several cultural and hybrid selection considerations here, are there not, Rodrigo?
So at this moment, right, there's nothing to do besides identify the disease in your field and potentially harvest early. However, for next season, things that we need to consider if you have problem this year, if you have had problems in the past, it's one, selecting hybrids with stay green characteristics, and that would help, the sustainability of those plants out there in the field. And also, what you want to do is to think about a crop rotation, right? You can go with alfalfa or small grains like wheat would be good suggestions for crop rotation as well. And just to add to that stay green characteristic, right, when you are choosing your hybrid, you also want to select one hybrid with good standability. So those things will help you to reduce those yield loss caused by the lodging.
And should a producer maybe even go one further and reflect on some of their approaches in as far as the stand density, how thick that crop was planted, or their nutrient management? All of these things could be contributing.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point. Because if we increase the plant population, right, basically we're subjecting those plants to more stress or stress conditions, especially in the lack of water, which was our summer. June, July was pretty dry and hot here in Kansas. So if lower populations will definitely help to avoid that stress. So it would be a good strategy as well.
Stalk rot disease in corn and grain sorghum may be problematic out there. Producers, as Rodrigo says, if you're not sure what's going on, do have a plant sample sent to the Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State. Through the help of your local Extension agricultural agent, you can get a positive identification and then have a notion of what might be done in a management sense, preventing this from happening again next year. By all means, check that out. Before we let you go, Rodrigo, hearing any other disease concerns out there. We haven't talked about soybeans yet. Charcoal rot's notorious in those as well at times. Could that be a possibility?
Yeah, we're already seeing some symptomatic plants showing up, especially now that the plants are drying out, right? Seeing quite a bit of charcoal rot as well in soybeans. So it's a good thing to think about like rotating with soybeans if you had charcoal rot problems, because this disease can infect either corn or soybeans. So it wouldn't be ideal crop rotation, right? What I have seen and heard more and more on the soybean side is the DECTs reports have been quite high, and I have observed unusual higher incidence of DECTs this year. So something to keep in mind as well, although we're on the disease side, but this is what I've been hearing. And just to add out there as well, we are currently offer free SCN soybean cyst nematode testing for our growers here in Kansas. This project is funded by the Soybean Coalition with checkoff money. So it's a good time as well after harvest. You're going to be out there in the field. Make sure to take advantage of this program. Send us a sample. We really want to see a couple of samples from now to, until the ground starts to freezing. It would be a good time to be looking at for the soybean cyst nematode as well.
And those samples for SCN can be channeled through local extension offices likewise to K-State for analysis, correct?
That's correct. The local extension agents will work with you, helping pull those samples. And just a quick reminder, right? For SCN, soybean cyst nematode, we want to sample that field from 0 to 6 inches. Just collect 10 to 15 probes in your field. Mix it well, send it 2 cups approximately of soil to the lab, and work with your extension agent. They will help you sending us those samples to us here.
Testing for SCN is vital to dealing with that particular pest problem in soybeans for sure. Follow up on that opportunity to get that done, as Rodrigo described right there. Talk with your local extension agricultural agent about it. Good summary, Rodrigo, on many a disease concern potentially out there in our row crops as we move through harvest time. Appreciate your time right here. Thank you.
Thank you.
He's Research and Extension Row Crop Disease Specialist Rodrigo Onofre with us on Agriculture Today. Now, this break. When we come back, we'll pass along the latest from the USDA on fall harvest progress in Kansas. That has moved along at a pretty good clip this past week, thanks to the open weather. K-State's Mike Brouk awaits with this week's edition of Milk Lines. And again, we've our finale, if you will, with K-State's Charlie Lee coming up. Please stay with us here on the K-State Radio Network. Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson back with you. Moving on now to this week's Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report out from the USDA for the week ending this past Sunday. Our topsoil moisture supplies in the state were at 1% surplus, 41% adequate, 58% short to very short. Subsoil moisture, not much better, 1% surplus, 45% adequate, and 54% short to very short. Winter wheat planting in the state, now 27% complete. That is very near the average for the date. Emergence of that new wheat crop at 6%. The condition of the Kansas corn crop, 54% good to excellent, 25% fair, 21% poor to very poor, with corn now having reached maturity at 81%, and the corn harvest is 36% complete. That's ahead of the 30% average for the date. Soybean crop conditions, 58% good to excellent, 28% fair, 14% poor to very poor. Soybeans dropping leaves now at 57%, and the soybean harvest is 4% complete. That's very near the average. And the grain sorghum crop in Kansas, 57% good to excellent, 29% fair, 14% at poor to very poor. Sorghum now mature is at 53%. That's quite ahead of the 40% average for the date. And the sorghum harvest is 11% done in Kansas. That's very near the average. For the overview of crop condition and harvest progress nationally now, we'll turn to the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey notes an extremely rapid pace of corn maturation in much of the country.
We saw a pretty good jump as corn harvest began to really accelerate into the Midwest during the last week. 18% of the U.S. crop has been cut by September 26th. That is ahead of the 5-year average of 15%, also ahead of last year's 14%.
Meanwhile,
at this point in the season, you really don't expect much swing in corn conditions. So as we look at the corn conditions for the week ending September 26th, no change from the previous week. Still looking at 59% good to excellent, 15% very poor to poor.
In the drought-affected western corn belt,
for the highest amount of the corn crop in very poor to poor condition, the Dakotas, North Dakota, South Dakota tied at 42%. Next on the list is Colorado, where it's really dried out late in the year across the Great Plains.
There was no change in overall soybean condition ratings compared to last week.
Like corn, we see very little change in the condition numbers. In fact, none at all. 58% good to excellent, 14% very poor to poor. That places this year's crop somewhat below last year's condition at this time. It's looking like North Dakota will probably end the season with the lowest condition ratings among major production states. 43% of the soybeans very poor to poor in North Dakota, followed by South Dakota 36% and Minnesota at 26%.
He notes that the pace of soybean crop development is faster than last year.
With the crop maturing early, we see harvest beginning at an ahead of average pace. 16% of the U.S. soybean crop already harvested by September 26th. That's 3 percentage points ahead of the 5-year average. It is, however, just slightly behind last year's pace.
Rippey paints a memorable image of winter wheat planting.
For producers that are brave enough to plant in dust, it has been a good planting season. And for that reason, we see planting advancing at an ahead of average pace, 34% of the intended acreage for winter wheat planted by September 26th.
He says some of the driest states have had the quickest planting progress.
Washington State, for example, 67% planted. And then following that, we have Nebraska, 61% planted. Also, more than half of the intended acreage has been planted in South Dakota, Colorado, and Idaho.
He adds that moisture is badly needed.
It is just simply so dry in some areas that it is holding back planting progress. Oregon, one of those states, only 10% of the acreage planted by September 26th. 5-year average is 23%.
Meanwhile, winter wheat emergence is on par with last year. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Now we'll hand it on over to K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk as he brings this week's edition of Milk Lines. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning when should we be starting to use winter pre-dip and post-dip on our dairy herd. As we think about the chill that we might have felt in the air here the last few days, winter is on its way, and we know we're going to face some challenges when those temperatures drop below freezing. So when we think about the animals in our herd and we think about the choices that we make, one of the important choices we make is what we use for post-dip when we're milking our dairy cows. All of you are very, very familiar with the different formulations that we have that are specially formulated for freezing temperatures during the winter time. They have an increased amount of teat conditioners and also other compounds in there that help condition the teat skin so that it does not chap as easy. Also, it helps in the healing process if teats become chapped. But here's what I want you to think about. Normally, when we think about winter post-dip, one of the important things to consider is that you really should start it before you need it. In other words, about 3 weeks before we think that we're going to be facing some freezing temperatures. And I would encourage you that that's probably either actual temperature or wind chills that are going to be below 30 degrees. We need to consider using this winter post-dip. And again, that needs to start about 3 weeks ahead of time. So probably, as we think in most of our areas in Kansas, that's going to be somewhere around the 1st of November. Now, there's an increased cost with that. I get that. However, if we allow those teats to become damaged by the first cold snap, which is often what we do on our dairies, then we're in a healing process, not a preventative process. Because of that healing process, we'll likely see an increase in somatic cell count, which is going to reduce milk production in our herd, as well as the quality of that milk due to the higher somatic cell count. So, I want to encourage you, number one, think about what's coming. If you don't have a supply of winter post-dip on hand, you need to get that on hand so it's ready to use before we get to those freezing temperatures. A couple other things to consider in this discussion is also bedding, making sure that we have adequate bedding available if we do get severely cold weather. And then the third thing to think about is windbreaks. You know, as cows exit that milking parlor, it's important to protect them from the wind, particularly when we have very low wind chills. So putting up snow fences or other materials to block the airflow as the cows go from the milking parlor to the housing area is very important in preventing chapped teats. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to consider today whether or not they're prepared for colder winter temperatures.
Thanks, Mike. And we'll be back for one last time at the microphone with K-State's Charlie Lee, next on Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today and our weekly wildlife management segment, the final installment, which we'll explain in a moment, with former K-State wildlife specialist Charlie Lee. And Charlie, for this occasion, we want to return to a topic. It's still primary in wildlife management considerations here in the state of Kansas and elsewhere, and that is prairie dogs and their purported competition with livestock for grazing resources. And as folks likely know, this is something that you have studied intently for years and years.
Yes, black-tailed prairie dogs have been a contentious subject for generations. I think they will continue to have a lot of controversy surrounding whether we allow prairie dogs to persist in unlimited numbers or whether we need to implement some methods of control. We do know that prairie dogs have value as a keystone species because of the habitat conditions that they create via their mounds and changes in vegetation and the burrows that are developed from mounds for their benefit to other wildlife species. However, the question becomes, are they truly competitors with livestock? Because that's the comment that I hear many times from livestock producers is, yes, these animals are changing the way my landscape looks.
To that question directly then, what is definitively known about that competition and how much of a reduction in vegetation availability occurs when prairie dogs are around?
Well, we have to start with, do they eat the same things? And when you look at the research, there's 9 plant species that account for about 95% of the diet of prairie dogs that are found in the Great Plains. Those same plant species account for about 85% of the diet of cattle. So the dietary overlap is substantial. But how much of the forage that is produced do prairie dogs actually consume? There's been a lot of work done there, and it started with one of the very first scientific papers on prairie dogs, which was done in 1902, that said it took 256 prairie dogs to consume as much as one cow. We know that prairie dogs can consume and clip more than 50 pounds per year. So if you have a density of prairie dogs of 10 adult prairie dogs per acre and 6 to 8 juveniles per acre, then you could lose around 800 pounds per acre per year. Well, so they can consume that amount. How much is produced? In the extreme western part of the state, research has been done that shows shortgrass prairie ranges from around 2,600 pounds per acre to 4,600 pounds of acre on net primary production. So when you look at those numbers, prairie dogs can consume almost half of that, and that's on some of the more productive sites. So we know that they eat the same thing, and they can consume, at the low end, about 20% of the net primary production, up to almost 100% of the net primary production that's produced.
But aligned with that, and over the longer term, that change in vegetation occurring because of the presence of prairie dogs, that's something to be thought of as well here.
Yes, a Kansas study showed that prairie dog colonies decreases vegetation height. They end up with a higher percent forb cover, a higher percent bare ground. We know that the changes in forage quality, you get an increase in the ratio of dead plant material to living, and we know that younger plants have a higher concentration of protein and are more easily digested than plants that are found away from colonies. So that slightly offsets that change in the vegetation component. We know that livestock will consume a higher percent of forbs at certain times of the year, and if forbs are being produced after continually grazing with prairie dogs, you have a little bit of benefit there.
It revolves around to the big question, can livestock grazing activity and prairie dog populations coexist on the prairie landscape?
Well, they can, but it certainly takes some management. Oftentimes, the question is posed as how much damage is really caused by prairie dogs? Is their actual average daily gain reduced? And is my gain per pasture reduced at the end of the season? Some good research done on prairie dogs at the Standing Rock Indian Reservation in the Dakotas. They've found that the gain varies depending on what percent of the pasture is occupied by prairie dogs, that the gain can be up to 7 pounds per acre if more than 75% prairie dog occupied, but the gain is about 30 pounds per acre if 0% of the pasture is occupied by prairie dogs. The individual steer performance can be maintained as long as prairie dog colonies expand, but it's going to require a reduction in stalking rate. People need to understand that prairie dogs are just another grazing animal, and you have to account for the number of prairie dogs that are on the site, and you have to account for the acres that are occupied by prairie dogs so you can calculate a percentage of that pasture that is occupied.
That's your message here, then, that one can manage for the situation successfully, it would seem, but it does take something of concerted effort.
Yes, producers that want to manage pastures that are occupied by prairie dogs have difficult choices to make. Mm-hmm. You've got to, on one hand, try to maintain high production and healthy grasslands. At the same time, you realize that too many grazers, whether they're livestock or prairie dogs or a combination, have the potential to end up with degraded rangelands.
It's something that needs to be looked at carefully. It has been for any number of years through research that Charlie and others have been involved with. That is managing prairie dogs in rangelands. It's a topic that will stick with us for a while, undoubtedly. Charlie, we wanted to round this out by noting this is our last visit right here. Folks may not know, actually, you formally retired back in December, but you were good enough to agree to stay with us for a few more months. But the time has come to put a capper on this weekly series for 31 years now. And yes, 31, that long. You've been a great informational outlet on wildlife management. So our thanks to you for lending all of that, and it's been a great run.
Yes, I've enjoyed my tenure as being on the radio. I hope folks found my programs of interest, and particularly hope that they've found them useful as they tried to do a better job of managing their operations and wildlife. So I guess as I conclude this, just say thank you for listening.
Well, speaking for many, your service to Kansas agriculture and beyond, extraordinarily appreciated, Charlie. Thank you. Former K-State wildlife specialist Charlie Lee. And our time's away for today. We appreciate you tuning in. Please be back with us tomorrow right here, won't you? Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.